That was published last year by the U.S. Treasury Department, and it was so funny that I had to share it just because it's one of those like long-term projections. It's like comical,
Yeah.
and basically their whole point was showing that if there's no changes made to the current kind of fiscal situation in the United States, that debt as a percentage of GDP will balloon comically in the decades ahead with really no end in sight. And I guess a scary thing about that chart is that assumes like no problems. That's kind of like no recessions, no wars, no XYZ. That's just kind of like business as usual if nothing's fixed. Of course, it can't actually end up looking like that because you'd run out of base dollars to support that. You'd eventually would have to print the difference, and therefore you'd have a rapid growth in nominal GDP, which would mostly be the inflation component, and it'd be a lot messier than that in real life, which is kind of why I kind of picked fun at them for publishing that chart.
Yeah.
And I've done actually similar analysis to what Parker just described, which is kind of looking at ratios of either money supply, like broad money supply to base money, or total debt to base money. And so you can plot them over time. And we did hit a peak back in around the global financial crisis. It was something like 60 to 1. I think his chart showed 52 trillion to less than a trillion. If you kind of do the numbers, it was like 60 or 65 to 1 ratio. And the last time we hit a super high ratio was actually 1929, like the early 1930s, before there was all sorts of like monetization then. And you kind of had this big echo happen ever since the global financial crisis, where we've been increasing the monetary base to try to catch up with that broader setup. And the 13 trillion I mentioned was specifically the offshore dollar-denominated debt. So that's like debt that would be owed by entities, either governments or corporations in places like Turkey, Brazil, China, countries on the world that use dollars. And the challenging thing here is that both assets and liabilities in many cases are denominated in dollars. So in the United States, for example, we have 100 or 200 trillion dollars in total assets. That includes real estate, stocks, bonds, things like that. Even if you just factor out the debt, you have basically real estate and stocks. That's on a pretty small monetary base. And then you have all those liabilities. And so it's kind of this like, that's why you get these like liquidity crunches when they try to do things like pull dollars out of the system, or if there's any sort of shock to income while all of these, assets and liabilities are highly levered compared to the monetary base. And you see a similar effect when you look globally. And essentially what we're seeing now with that chart you brought up is just that right now the US is on this very unsustainable fiscal path where they're running very, very large deficits. And historically, the way you deal with that is you kind of monetize it. If you're an emerging market and you owe debt that you can't print, like if you're Argentina and you owe dollars, you just kind of have to default or ask for like a restructuring. Whereas if the liabilities are in your own currency, like if you're America with dollars, if you're Japan with yen, you essentially print the difference, but that leads to inflation. You're inflating away part of the debt. And right now they're kind of in that counter push where they're kind of trying to get the wheels back on the cart. They're kind of trying to say, no, this is sustainable. We're going to get back to like financial discipline. And it's one of those things. If you do the math and you do somehow conclude that they can do it, if you think, okay, they can return to structurally positive real yields, they can get this under control. They're going to do all sorts of fiscal adjustments to get the debt under control. They're going to start paying it down. Then that's a good case to buy and own dollars long term.
Welcome to Zero Sum Investing, where we provide news on the world's financial markets. Remember to smash the like button and subscribe to us.
Another challenge with printing money is that it's not distributed back to everyone equally, or it's basically dispersed, picking winners or losers based on policymaker decisions. And obviously in different eras that can favor different groups. It also generally favors debtors over savers because more money is being created, but all the debts are still denominated in the prior unit. One way to quantify it is that something like 6 trillion, and it's gone down a little bit, but like something like 6 trillion new broad money was created since the start of 2020. And so it's not just, bank reserves. It's actually, it's being created, but then it was also dispersed out into the broad money supply due to, just various fiscal programs. And if you divide that by the number of households in the United States, it's about 130 million households. So if you do the math, it's something like $46,000 per household. Wow. And so if you're a household and if you you go back and say, okay, how much did I get from the government? You add up the stimulus checks, you add up child tax credits, things like that. Does it come anywhere near $46,000? And of course, the answer is no. And there were, on the other hand, PPP loans. Everyone talks about the stimulus checks. I think that PPP loans are under talked about because, businesses could apply for $250,000, $1 million, $2 million. I forget the exact upper limit. It was like $1 million or $2 million. You could apply for these massive loans that then get turned into grant. They just get forgiven. And you had to sign up and say, okay, I'm going to pay my employees. This is necessary to continue operations. But a lot of businesses got them, they were kind of structured around the idea of like an independent restaurant. They're told to shut down, but we don't want them to go out of business, so we're going to give them a grant to keep going. And few people would criticize that specific application. But when you actually look at what happened, there was like law firms and like investment firms. They were like, yeah, we need the money to like pay our employees, and they didn't lose profits. And so all that money just goes straight to the owner's bottom line because he's like, oh yeah, I paid that to the employees, but that just means that the income that they got just got to go up to them. And so a lot of cases you had millionaires get, $250,000, $500,000 injections right to their net worth, while, the typical American got a few $1,000s in stimulus checks and a few $1,000s in child tax credits. And so basically you siphoned off everyone's savings and then you could redirect it in certain ways. A similar thing happened during the global financial crisis where they bailed out banks, but they didn't bail out homeowners to nearly the same degree. Yeah. And, even like if you have liquidity in the moment where no one else has liquidity, like if everything's like selling off due to fire sale prices and the dollar's soaring and things are getting crushed, and you give out liquidity to key institutions that can go and basically buy things or make really good loans and things like that, then they come out of that stronger than ones that weren't given that sort of lifeline. In addition, during the pandemic, let's say you were a gigantic restaurant corporation, you have access to public capital markets, the Fed was in there keeping the bond market liquid, right? They were literally buying corporate bonds, they were keeping the bond market liquid, whereas if you were a small restaurant, an individual, just a family-run restaurant, you're trying to get credit and trying to, get liquidity, keep going in that environment, a lot of banks would just say no, and the Fed just doesn't have the logistics to go around and help every mom and pop restaurant out there. It kind of inherently favors these larger entities. And so basically by having a public ledger that can then be, drained and directed in certain ways, it's easy to either purposely or accidentally direct it towards people that are already near the top of the system. I put that as a thought experiment because so many people in developed countries don't think about money that often. Whereas people in developing countries have to think about it more specifically. And so a lot of people, when I asked that, I was basically, that was based on, as you put out, like I have family and friends in Egypt, and for example, some of them were trying to sell a multifamily property, it has some logistics to it because they're going to get dispersed and not all going to be able to buy a home at the same time, and they want to figure out, they want to be able to save that in a liquid form. And at the time, some of them were talking about saving it in Egyptian bonds. And this was before the big currency crisis happened. And I was like, you're going to do what? You're going to put them all in Egyptian bonds? Like literally, you could get wiped out. Yeah. And so we were kind of exploring alternatives. And so it sparked the question months later that I asked on Twitter. And a lot of people responded and they just said, I would hold dollars. So then I was like, well, where specific are you going to hold dollars? Because, for example, there are periods where if you hold dollars in a Lebanese bank or an Argentinian bank in one of these places, they just get taken from you. The bank, the government or the bank says, okay, well, those are not your dollars anymore. We're going to give you a similar amount of pesos, to buy them from you at the official exchange rate, which is not the real exchange rate, and then you just continue getting inflated away. An alternative is some people turn to stable coins. Obviously, those have counterparty risk as well. The counterparty is outside of the country, so if anything, it's safer than, say, if you're sticking them in an Argentinian bank, but it's still obviously not ideal. You can do physical dollars, you can do gold. There's really no clean solution historically for people in this environment. And then Bitcoin is obviously a good solution, but it's still small and volatile, and so they have to incorporate that into their analysis. It's still a much smaller, more nascent asset. And it just shows essentially that the world has a money problem which remains unresolved unless or until we see more of an outcome from this. Yeah. And it's just something that people in the United States and Europe and Japan just rarely have to think about. And this was around the margins. People that are paying attention think about it because cash savings are the interest rates are below the inflation rates. Same thing for most government bonds. There's even that period of negative nominal bonds that was around the world in kind of that disinflationary bubble. So people around the margins are kind of pointed in that, but people in a lot of developing countries experience it in a more like in their face way. So I think it's a good start. I mean, historically, Bitcoin bottoms have been a process. That's true for a lot of other asset classes as well. And if you go back to actually the earlier part of the discussion, we talked about liquidity, right? So liquidity conditions all throughout 2022 were worsening based on various ways of measuring it that I talked about before, until we got to around Q4. At that point, the Treasury General Account was drawing down, which was actually pushing liquidity back into the market and offsetting some of the Fed quantitative tightening. Basically, more of that monetary base was kind of out into the world rather than locked away. And so it's kind of this like temporary offset. And now with the debt ceiling, they're unable to issue new debt. And so what historically happens is some of the measures they take to avoid defaulting until that's sorted out is that they empty out their cash account. It's kind of like if you lost your income, but you had some savings and you still pay your bills for a few more months. That's kind of what the Treasury's doing right now, and that's actually ironically good for market liquidity in the moment that it's happening.